Dr. Mark Trexler is the Director of Climate Change Knowledge Systems. He has more than 30 years of energy, environmental, and climate change experience and expertise. He has advised and taught clients around the world on climate science and climate risk, and so much more. So tell us a little bit about Mark.
33 years of climate science. I mean, bless you, Mark, bless you. Thinking of all the ups and downs that this guy has probably gone through, I started becoming aware of, I guess, the climate changes just as a guy who grew up in North Dakota. And you could see, when I was growing up, you could see as far as you could see with no regional haze, nothing impeding your line of sight. And now, like where I live, it's very visible, it's very present, and it's everywhere, now. And so the atmosphere has a very unique way of balancing all of, anything that gets put in the air. It's a equilibrium, so it's a distribution. So if you're putting pollution in the air, it's going to equally distribute across the whole planet. So there's no not in my backyard and things like that. And so it's very interesting. When I talked to Mark, he was telling me about all the things that they've done around, he's the climatographer, a cartographer that works on climate science. And, that is such an interesting thing because you can't really visualize what is happening in the climate, but he's literally created a map, that really explains, and he's got so much information and so much data that it's undeniable what's happening in across the climate, from across the globe, I guess, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I was so excited when I talked to him. I'm like, Mark, you got to come. We need you. There's a lot of people that are just want more information about what's going on, as it relates to the climate, because it changes, it's changing. And so it was really important that we had Mark here to try to, digest it for us and really explain, more what's going on.
Right. All right. We're super excited to learn. Let's welcome to the stage Dr. Mark Trexler.
Thanks. So I am a climate person, and I'm not going to be talking a lot today about regenerative agriculture, but I did take the advantage of the fact that I was coming out to visit a friend's regenerative ranch just outside of New Plymouth, and that was really interesting. He's raising red Angus, and so seeing all the different things that he's doing around regenerative ranching was fascinating. And I also really liked Ray Achueta's talk yesterday morning, and I think he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he started out by saying that, I despair, but here's a hopeful message. And anyone who has spent 30 years working on climate change certainly has the despair part down. There's also a hopeful message, which I'll be delivering, but I'll also be building on that, and that's the idea of climate chess. I'll be adding the strategy side, because hope is not a strategy. And up to this point, there's a lot of hope out there, but there's not a lot of strategy of how to get us there. Now, one thing, if you're all going to race to Amazon to try and find the board game planetary chess, climate chess, you won't find it. It's not that kind of a game. Everybody does that, so I have to explain it's not actually a board game. So let me go ahead and give you just a very quick introduction to my climate journey, which might be helpful here. I was hired into the World Resources Institute. I was hired into the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. in 1988, which was the same year that Jim Hansen, one of the famous climate scientists, gave his testimony in front of Congress that climate change had arrived. And so that's when I started working on the issue. I was actually brought into the World Resources Institute to work on the first carbon offset project as part of voluntary carbon markets. It was a project in Guatemala, an agroforestry project, as you can see in the picture there. And I did some of the first studies on natural climate solutions. 1991, we published Minding the Carbon Store, which was the first look at U.S. Natural climate solutions potentials, and then we looked at tropical potentials later on. And after that, I got into management consulting and started the first consultancy working with businesses on climate change, and did that in 1991. And as I've been working on this topic over the years, it's occurred to me, or it's really become clear to me, that climate change is an enormous knowledge management challenge. The information is out there for all of these things we want to do. The information is out there to convince almost anyone to change their behavior, to change their thinking about climate change. But getting the right information to the right person at the right time is almost impossible. And it's sort of this great wall that you can see in the cartoon here, because there's misinformation, there's self-interest, there's all sorts of cognitive challenges on a topic like climate change, and it's ultimately a wicked problem, which I'll get into a little more. And so, how do we actually make this happen? And we've heard this theme repeatedly during the course of the conference, that there needs to be more collaboration, there needs to be more knowledge sharing, and we talk about that a lot, but how do we actually do it? And that's what we're focused on in terms of trying to deliver. So, a couple of thoughts about knowledge management and the potential of knowledge management, and I love these two quotes. One is from Carla Odell, who is one of the mothers of knowledge management. If only we knew what we know. And think about that for a second. We know a lot, but we don't know almost anything in terms of what we can actually individually keep in our heads at any given time. It's not a lot, and it's the thinnest slice of the overall knowledge that is out there on almost any topic. And Woodrow Wilson has a great quote: "There is no idea in our heads that has not been worn shiny by someone else's brain." We don't need to be reinventing the wheel all the time. It's already out there. It's very likely that it's already out there, and we should be taking advantage of it. So about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we started building what we call the Climate Web, which is a knowledge management system covering basically all climate change topics, including regenerative ag and all the natural climate solutions, but the politics, the communication, the psychology, everything that we might need to be able to really tackle this problem if we wanted to do something collaborative, if we wanted to do something strategic. We've pulled it together into the Climate Web. And we've used it with companies and we've used it with organizations, and it's a very powerful system. It's also totally open access online. Anybody can get to it, and I'll give you the link to it a little later. But it's the closest thing today to a collective intelligence on climate change. So I'm going to talk about 4 things today. First is a very quick sort of status report. Where are we with climate change? Second, talking about climate change as a wicked problem, which is something we don't do enough of, because the fact that climate change is a wicked problem has a lot of implications for our ability to actually tackle it and solve it. I'll get into the climate chess as an alternative metaphor, and I'll tell you what I mean by alternatives when we get there. And then digging a little bit deeper into this idea of if only we knew what we know, and how the climate web that we've developed can support a lot of the kinds of things that people have been talking about here at the conference. So first, a very quick status report. First of all, we've been talking about climate risk for a long time. Now, you may be aware that people started talking about carbon in the atmosphere and it might warm the atmosphere. That conversation dates back more than 100 years. But people weren't talking about risk. They were talking simply about the fact that over time we might see some warming, but they weren't thinking of it from a risk perspective. The first risk paper on climate change, presenting climate change as a risk to society, was actually published the year I was born, 1957. So we've been talking about climate change from a risk perspective for a long time. I won't tell you how many years. The first presidential briefing on climate risk was in 1965. And so, that's when it sort of really entered the policy sphere. A lot has happened since then, but the key takeaway is that while we've been doing all this talking, while we've had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, while we've had the Kyoto Protocol, while we've had the Paris Agreement, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has just continued going up. And so we just hit 419 parts per million compared to the 278 parts per million that we've had for thousands of years, basically. And so, that number just keeps getting worse. It's just been an inexorable rise, and it's going to continue rising. So how much climate change will we see? And I love these stripes diagrams. You can get these stripes diagrams now for pretty much any state, any city, any country, telling you where we've been from a temperature perspective and where we're headed. And there are different pathways here. We don't know the future. There is some possibility that we could stay or get onto the lower pathway here. Seems more likely that we'll be on the upper pathway, because that's much more consistent with what we've seen in the last several decades. Neither of these pathways is particularly pretty from an outcomes perspective. Just to give you one example, over time, historically speaking, for every 1 degree centigrade of climate change that the Earth has experienced, sea levels have risen by 60 feet per 1 degree. And we're already over 1 degree. So we're not going to see 60 feet of sea level rise tomorrow, but we're likely to see it over time. The bad news here is that we're underestimating the risks of climate change. If you're at all familiar with the idea of sort of this fat tail probability distribution, there's the stuff that we think is most likely to happen, and that's that most likely on the probability, the expected outcomes. Scientists don't want to be alarmists, so they focus on the expected outcomes, the most likely outcomes. That's not where the risk is. The risk is farther out on the consequences distribution, and there are tons of what people often call gray rhinos sitting out there, which are things that we know are coming. We may not know exactly when, et cetera. We may not know when we'll spot that rhino, but we know it's either charging or starting to charge. And there are a lot of climate change gray rhinos sitting out there. And then, of course, you've got the whole idea of black swans, things we haven't even thought of yet, but that will also be out there. And that's where the climate risk is. And because we're so focused on this most likely outcome, we're missing in many of the climate change conversations, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and sort of the scientific conversations, we're missing most of the risk of climate change. And that's bad news. The good news is that there are lots of pathways forward on this. There is more going on today than ever has been the case before. The mindsets are better than ever before. We have activism, we have business action, we have consumers getting interested, the possibility of dietary change, all kinds of technology, innovation, the list goes on and on. Even carbon offsets, just talked about, carbon capture and storage. So there is an enormous amount of positive work going on and potential for real progress. But, and this is what the point of this maze is, we have to remember that climate change is still and will remain a wicked problem. And there's a whole literature around what wicked problems are, but it has particular characteristics. So there is no obvious answer. There are no silver bullets. Regenerative ag is not a silver bullet any more than nuclear energy is a silver bullet for climate change, and we love silver bullets, so it's a bit of a thing that we have to get past. If you solve one thing, you're often creating another problem with wicked problems. Massive cognitive dissonance. We all love the fact that we can jump in a car with energy stored in gasoline, which is an incredibly good way to store energy, and just zip off and do anything we want to do. So then when somebody comes and says, well, let's increase your gas prices by $2 a gallon, even though you're a climate change person, there's cognitive dissonance there. And it's a big problem for actually seeing real progress on climate change. But there are lots of other things that there's a lot of information on now. Lots of books have been written on the psychology of climate change, and I particularly love this quote, our risk brains, in terms of how we think about risk and how we perceive risk. Our risk brains are still searching for lions in the Serengeti. because we simply haven't had enough time for our risk brains to evolve to keep up with the kinds of problems that we're now facing. Another great quote in a book by Margaret Heffernan came out in 2011, "In failing to address climate change, all the forces of willful blindness come together like synchronized swimmers in a spectacular water ballet." I love that quote. It really tells us why it is so hard to get our heads around climate change and making some real progress. It doesn't help that we're operating in an economic system that sort of downplays the whole idea of climate change. If you discount the future at 5%, 10%, 15%, which is what we do, climate change basically disappears as a problem. You don't, as Lester Lave says in this quote, it doesn't matter anymore if it's more than 10, 15, 20 years into the future. And that's, from a sustainability standpoint, that's a bit of a problem. But we're operating within that system. And this has led people who think about wicked problems to be pretty pessimistic. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning economist, behavioral economist, has this quote, "I am deeply pessimistic. I really see no path to success on climate change." From a risk perspective, Paul Slovic, a noted risk expert, doesn't even work on climate change. He says, look, I'm focused on genocide. I only work on one impossible problem from hell at a time. And so the people who are thinking about wicked problems and this kind of thing are not particularly happy about our possibilities going forward. And I would analogize much of what we've tried to do about climate change as really quite analogous to the charge of the Light Brigade against artillery positions in the Crimean War. It didn't end well. And climate change isn't ending well either, and yet we continue to do the same thing over and over again in terms of trying to solve the problem. A great quote, actually it turns out Einstein didn't say it, but it's a great quote, so I'll use it anyway, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And we all do it. And at some point we ought to rethink sort of our insanity when it comes to how we're really trying to make progress on climate change. So if we wanted to think differently about acting on climate change, here I would argue is the key basis for why there is reason to think about doing things really differently. The Yale Project on Climate Communications has been tracking sort of what they call 6 Americas, which you can see here on the slide, ranging from alarmed to dismissive. They've been tracking the American population and figuring out how many people fit into each of these different Americas. And now the number is higher than it's ever been for the alarmed and the concerned. More than 100 million people are alarmed or concerned about climate change. 100 million people. Grandparents, millennials, even some politicians, innovators, some business leaders, app designers. I sort of threw that in just because it's remarkable how many apps are coming out on climate change. I'm not sure we need thousands of apps on climate change, but a different topic. But we have a huge number of people who are alarmed or concerned about climate change. So how many of that 100 million population are operating on all cylinders when it comes to actually making progress on climate change? 343 of those 100 million. Obviously a made-up number, maybe it's 500 people out of 100 million. But the reality here is that people have no idea what and how to do something about climate change. Well, what are we telling those 100 million people to do? Because it's not as if they're not hearing about climate change in the news and in the newsletters, et cetera. We're telling them to shrink their footprint. We're telling them to eat less meat. Many of us are telling them to eat less meat. We're telling them to have one fewer child. I'm certainly not telling them that because it's a silly idea. But that is, a lot of publications are out there saying the biggest thing you can do for the planet is have one fewer child. All sorts of weird things about that statement, but we'll leave that. Or divest fossil fuels, talk about climate change, which actually turns out to be critically important. Invest in low carbon, net zero, offset your footprint. Lots of things. None of these things will scale to actually significantly impacting climate change. They may be very important psychologically, they may be motivation for people, and many of these are perfectly good ideas, but they will not scale. They are individual action, they are not collective action. Now, you might say, well, you've got something on there called vote. Isn't that the collective action side of this? And yes, in a sense, it's supposed to be, but there's actually a very interesting book that came out last year called The Politics Industry, which explores this question of, is voting leading at all to the outcomes that we want? Not per se, not specifically on climate change, but just generally from a societal perspective. And the answer is absolutely not. The system is broken and it is not contributing to solving societal problems. You can obviously read the book, but there's a great podcast, and it's called the Realignment Podcast, and episode 131 has an interview with the author, which gives you the gist of their research and their findings, and is certainly worth downloading and listening to. But even if voting is a good idea, and I'm certainly not arguing not to vote, people should clearly vote, but what about the other 729 days of the voting cycle or of the election cycle? Even if you go out and vote, that doesn't mean you should just be sitting around doing nothing for the other 729 days. So what is it that people ought to be doing? And this all comes down to sort of this tension between individual action and collective action that I've already mentioned. And so, when we think about sustainability and resilience, and at an individual level, we go to the gym, we recycle, we eat organic food, but then we keep going on up the cliff or up the hill, and we eventually go off the cliff into climate change, because those things will not do anything about climate change. You're talking individual action, individual resilience. You're not talking systems change and collective action. And that's where we need to be talking. And so when we see these types of measures, which we see all the time, or this type of advice, every action matters. It's the wrong message, because it's just not true that every action matters or that every action matters the same. This kind of approach encourages everyone to focus on whatever they want to focus on, whatever they're happiest focusing on, whatever is easiest for them to focus on, and does not actually lead to a strategy that gets us out of the problem. So we're often messaging this stuff quite incorrectly. Now, Margaret Mead has a great quote, which she actually did say, and I agree with it entirely. A small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. We don't need 100 million people all doing exactly the same thing. But Margaret Mead was not saying, do whatever you want and the world will change. That's not the message of that quote. She's suggesting that with the right strategy, a small group can change the world. This tension between individual action, collective action. I just happened a few weeks ago to listen to another podcast, and this is the name of the podcast is How to Save a Planet, and they had an episode on March 18th on exactly this question of individual action versus collective action. Again, a podcast, 45 minutes, very much worth listening to, because they dig into this question in a lot of detail. But I thought it was interesting the result that they came to, because what they told all of their listeners to do was to draw these Venn diagrams. So draw a Venn diagram. What are you good at? What brings you joy? What's needed to solve climate change? And then whatever is in the middle, that's how you can contribute to collective action and climate change mitigation. It's not going to work. Having individuals sort of figure out how I individually can lead to collective action on climate change just isn't going to happen. It's not in the cards. So that's where climate chess comes in. From a strategic standpoint, how do we get millions of people collaborating to make some progress, including on things like regenerative agriculture? So I've always loved this cartoon that came out in 2010 from an Australian cartoonist. We're pleased with our progress, and it's on the million-piece jigsaw puzzle for climate change, and there are about 12 pieces that seem to be in the right place on the board. And the idea of a million-piece jigsaw puzzle is a useful because at least it gets us away from the idea of silver bullets. And it gets us into the idea that a lot of people are talking about of silver buckshot. So let's stop arguing about, which silver bullet is the right one, even though we love to do that. And let's think more about what's the silver buckshot that we ought to be doing something with in terms of trying to tackle the larger problem. Now, the jigsaw metaphor is an interesting metaphor, and there are thousands, including some of the ones that we've heard about yesterday and today, and people in the room. There are thousands of jigsaw puzzle pieces being worked on, each individually, and we tend to develop silos around each of these. So we work with our own very small community on these individual jigsaw puzzles. The good news is that there are thousands of these things out there. The bad news is that we're sort of assuming there's a whole bunch of chimpanzees in the next room trying to put this jigsaw puzzle together, and that eventually they'll succeed on their own, as opposed to a collaborative strategy. Because the reality is that all of the puzzle pieces that people are working on are not of equal importance at any given time. And the time element here is critical, because at any given time, there might be 25 things that we could really make progress on if we had the right resources and the right players involved. 6 months later, it might be a different list in terms of the politics, the economics, public opinion. The importance of these pieces changes over time, and it doesn't make sense to think of this as all of these pieces are of equal value at any given point in time. So what if we put all of those same jigsaw puzzle pieces, what if we converted them over to a chessboard, a planetary chessboard, and sort of thinking of it that way? Right now, all of these pieces are sort of individually moving on their own, no particular coordination, which makes it hard to win at the game of chess. But they're there, they're on the board. The other thing that this does is get us to realize that there's two teams on the board. We're not all on the same team here. There's team urgency that says, look, we need to do something about this problem. There's team no urgency that says, well, I don't know, maybe, but later. So there are two teams on this board, and as I've mentioned, in tackling climate change, not all options are created equal. Now, we all know that greenwashing is a bad idea, but I would actually argue that green wishing today is a bigger problem than greenwashing, because there is so much green wishing going on that has no particular evidentiary basis. It's not evidence-based, but it's sort of, well, hope. And again, if we're trying to tackle climate change in the next 20 years, the next 25 years, green wishing isn't going to get us there. And the idea of climate chess is to say, let's think of all these different chess pieces on the board, and let's figure out which ones are evidence-based, which ones we can move today, which ones we can move tomorrow, and collectively make some progress on the larger board. So just to give you a little bit of an analogy between conventional chess and climate chess. Conventional chess, as you well know, well, most chess, two teams. Lots of different pieces with different capabilities on the board. Any piece can be very important in the right situation at the right time. Important to remember for climate chess as well. Millions of potential permutations to the game. So that's conventional chess. So let's think for a second about climate chess. Lots of players, hundreds of different players, but they can pretty easily be moved into two camps in terms of team urgency and team no urgency. We don't have to have 100 chess teams on the board. They view a lot of different things can be happening at the same time. One of the challenges here is that some players are actually playing on both teams at the same time, which makes the game a little more interesting, shall we say, but it's a reality. There are lots of different permutations. Players have different skills, different capabilities, different resources that they're bringing to the table. And Team Urgency, Team No Urgency, both have a lot of moves and pieces available to them, but Team No Urgency, all it has to do is protect the status quo. And it doesn't have to change the status quo, and it is much easier to protect the status quo than it is to change it. And so Team No Urgency has some very powerful moves and pieces that they don't even need to move that much because they're so powerful in being able to protect the status quo. Something that really differentiates the Team No Urgency from the Team Urgency is that Team No Urgency actually knows it's playing climate chess. You know, Team No Urgency has been collaborating, a lot of the key players, for decades to slow down progress in tackling climate change. And if you don't think that they know that they're playing climate chess, you ought to read Naomi Oreskes' Merchants of Doubt, which isn't about, I mean, it gets into climate change, but it goes through the whole tobacco thing and some of the other sort of big cases where you have sort of these Team No Urgencies that are actively involved in the game. So Team No Urgency knows it's playing climate chess. It's doing a pretty good job, and it's been winning at the game for decades. Team Urgency, there are a lot of different players, a lot of pieces, et cetera, but in some ways, they're competing with each other so much to say, hey, I'm the most important piece on this board, that you end up with in a situation where, number one, it's not at all clear they know they're playing climate chess, and with friends like these, who needs enemies? Because you've got, you know, the 100% renewable energy people attacking the nuclear energy people. You've got the no meat people attacking the holistic grazing people. I mean, everybody's so busy fighting with each other on this that we're sort of forgetting that we're on the climate chessboard and that we're running out of time to avoid some of the more cataclysmic implications of climate change. So, you know, the good news, again, is that there are lots of things that we can do and lots of players on this board, but to the extent that they're all fighting with each other more than they're focusing on Team No Urgency, we're not getting where we need to go, and we're really missing out on an opportunity to make some real progress. So what if the Team No Urgency players came together and said, hey, yeah, the Team Urgency players came together and said, yeah, you know, we're Team Urgency. We can really make progress here if we collaborate and if we help move some of these things forward. First of all, recognizing that it's a wicked problem, that there are no silver bullet solutions for any of the many solutions that people are talking about, and there are a couple of hundred at this point in terms of solutions that people are talking about, you know, solar radiation management, ocean carbon sequestration. I mean, all sorts of things are under discussion, and a lot of those have potential, but none of them are silver bullets. And we're in a bad enough situation with climate change that we ought to be thinking about how do we leverage and activate all of these different pieces to the extent we can in the situation where we can make the most progress at any given time. So thinking about climate change and climate as a system and using that all of the above strategy that I just mentioned, implementing strategies, and I'll get to this again in just a second, you know, what I'm talking about doing here in terms of the practicalities is not new. We do it, politicians do it to win elections, and I'll give you a specific example in just a second. But people know how to get the right information to the right person at the right time if they want that person to vote for them. We know how to do that. Why aren't we doing anything analogous for the 100 million people who would like to be doing something about climate change but have no idea what to do? And so, you know, what would it take? Well, if you had 100 people in a Team Urgency war room with the right resources, the right computers, the right capabilities, you could run climate chess, and Team Urgency could be playing a much better game of climate chess than it currently is. You do need resources, but tracking down where the opportunities are to move, what can be done at any given time. Again, you don't need 100 million people to understand this. You need 100 people to understand this who can then communicate effectively with the 100 million or the 50 million or whatever. And you need the artificial intelligence to help put these things together. We have the technology. We're not using it for sort of the collaborative purpose here. And this has all kinds of ramifications, even for the stuff that we've been hearing about in this conference and the whole regen ag. How many people of that 100 million know what regenerative agriculture is, or know that they have the opportunity to support perhaps certain producers, et cetera, et cetera? It is a very small number. How could we get the right information to the right people at the right time to change that system? So there are 3 steps, and I'm not going to go through all these bullet points, obviously, but if you had a team urgency war room that was trying to manage this whole thing, first you'd get people to sign up. They'd go to a website. You'd be able to find out from them, hey, what is it you have? Do you have time? Do you have resources? Do you have expertise? What is it that you have to bring to the table? And they would fill that out, and then you would slice and dice that information. But you'd also, and I just got ahead of myself with step 2, I apologize. The first step is just getting people engaged and motivating them to stay engaged. Because people are interested and concerned or alarmed about climate change for all kinds of different reasons. There is no one-size-fits-all message on any of this stuff. There are lots of messages for lots of audiences. So first, you need to figure out why is it that people are concerned, and then you need to help keep them engaged by feeding them the right information that keeps them motivated. Next, you build up their profile. You sort of figure out what is it they're bringing to the table. Again, the expertise, what's the age, gender, skill sets, education level, risk background, job, all these different things, because those are going to be important in assigning those people or helping inform those people about which options it makes sense for them to be getting engaged with, which is sort of just a couple of examples on the right. What is this? I keep skipping ahead. With the kinds of things, whether it's lobbying, whether it's financing, whether it's fundraising, whether it's leading, whether it's dialoguing, different people, different opportunities, match them up, keep them informed on a regular basis, and that's sort of the key part for step 3 here is keeping track of the fact that all of these things are changing over time. So the opportunity to move different pieces on the board might be different in January, March, or May. So in January, you tell people, hey, the best way you can contribute to climate change mitigation this month is support Group A. In March, it might be, hey, Texas is reviewing its textbooks on how to talk about climate change, and we could really use some help in influencing that process. In July, it might be a carbon tax petition. In September, it might be a particular kind of litigation in terms of the Children's Trust litigation on climate change. So the opportunity to move pieces on the board is not static. And if instead of people just being stuck with one particular organization that they're part of or one community that they're part of, what if those millions of people could move between communities, between organizations, to help move particular pieces on the board forward at the opportune time? Now, one question you might have is, well, where are we going to find all the chess pieces? I mean, what are some of these chess pieces that are out there? You may be familiar with Project Drawdown. It's gotten a huge amount of press in the last couple of years. They've identified 80 different technologies and not just technologies, but 80 different, basically, pieces on the chessboard, all the way, reducing food waste, geothermal energy, managed grazing, plant-rich diet, all kinds of things. One of their top things, actually, is educating girls. on the basis of assuming that educating girls in developing countries reduces fertility rates, reduces population, reduces pressure, which is a lot of different intermediate steps. But they've looked and they said, hey, here are the 80 things that we ought to be focusing on today, and here are sort of 20 up-and-coming things that we ought to be keeping our eyes on. So there's a lot of work that's already going on what are the chess pieces that are out there. Another really interesting study is this one. This study came out also a couple of years ago, a huge report. You can certainly download it if you want, but legal pathways to deep decarbonization in the United States. They looked at all the different groups that are involved. So in a sense, the players on the chessboard, whether it's the executive branch, companies, individuals, they identified something like 1,200 chess pieces. And they obviously did not call them chess pieces, but they identified 1,200 interventions that if we made progress on those interventions, we would be making a lot of progress on climate change. So we have the chess pieces. That work has already been done, and they also have it by all the different types of interventions for or different things you can do for advancing climate change mitigation. So there's lots of work that has already been done that we can take advantage of if we wanted to actually play climate chess. So if we want to make some progress, if we want to recognize that hope is not a strategy for climate change, why can't we figure out how to coordinate individual action, business action, consumer action, climate literacy, policies and measures, technology innovation, instead of having a million different silos, each hoping that they're going to make a difference, and in a sense trying to put together that massive jigsaw puzzle, but focusing on the pieces, not focusing on the outcome. And the idea of climate chess is let's focus on the outcome and figure out how to use the pieces to that end in a collaborative way. I said I'd come back to a particular example. Whether you love Donald Trump or you hate Donald Trump doesn't really matter for this purpose, but the point is that this is how Trump's presidential campaign won. They got the right information to the right person at the right time to cause various things to happen, which led them to win the election. And the head of that effort, Brad Pascale, has basically laid that out and laid out what they did. They were playing presidential chess. They certainly weren't playing climate chess, but they were playing presidential chess. And the point is, we know how to do this. So why aren't we doing it? If you want to explore this idea in a little more detail, you can go to a particular website that we've built called climatechess.climatesites.net, and I'll be integrating more information from this talk into it. This is actually a technology that we've developed that allows us to extract information from that climate web that I had mentioned to you and present it in a very easy-to-use website format that people are more comfortable with. It's less scary than the climate web itself, and we've got dozens of these websites out there for particular purposes. If somebody's interested in using the climate web to put together Regen Ag 101, 202, 303 in this kind of a website format as a resource to point people to using information that we already have in the climate web, I'm happy to talk to people about doing that. But I am going to spend, why is there no text on that slide? Okay. I am going to spend just a little bit of time introducing you a bit more to the climate web, not only because it's the right tool, or it's a tool that makes it possible for us to play climate chess, but it's also a tool that any of you might be able to use if you're interested in looking into particular questions, whether it's carbon pricing, carbon offsets, ecosystem services markets, whether they're coming or not coming, regen ag, the psychology of climate change. All of these things are easy to access in the climate web if you spend a couple of minutes coming up the learning curve. And just going back to these original quotes, imagine what we could accomplish if we actually lived by these two quotes and said, we're going to start taking advantage of the infinity of information that is already out there, and we're going to figure out how to apply it in a way that helps us get where we're trying to go. I will mention the software that we use for the Climate Web is called The Brain, and what we've built with the Climate Web really is a climate brain. I personally think that knowledge management, and for the same reasons that a number of speakers have sort of brought up the idea a little less directly, knowledge management is probably the single most important topic that we don't teach to anyone in our school system at any level. So even though a great quote from sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, we're drowning in information, we're starving for wisdom, we need to be managing the information that we already have to be able to make progress on a whole series of problems that we're facing, not just climate change, but a whole series of problems. And if people would start doing more with knowledge management, it would position us well. By the way, that particular software, it's a commercial software, it's at thebrain.com. I have no financial interest in the software whatsoever, but you can download the free version and start managing knowledge. And there are also ways to use it in a collective way, which is what we do with the Climate Web. Just to give you a sense of what's in the Climate Web as a collective climate intelligence today, 1,000 books, 3,000 videos, thousands of websites, 20,000 reports, 30,000 news and opinion pieces, 3,500 index entries that make it easy to sort of find exactly where you want to go to find what you're looking for, more than 1,000 topical dashboards. One thing that people always ask is, well, how did you build this? I mean, is this bots running around the internet at night and populating the Climate Web during the night? And the answer is no. Every single link, in terms of the 120,000 individual thoughts, the 210,000 physical links, every single one we've done by hand in terms of with the goal of linking information, slicing and dicing information in ways that make it useful to different audiences, because there is no one size fits all. If we can slice and dice information so that it's useful to a school teacher, so it's useful to a university student, so it's useful to a rancher, so it's useful to an activist. If we can slice and dice the same information, and that's what knowledge management tools like the Brain allow us to do, then that information starts to become actionable. And that's what's really missing in most of this stuff, is people's access to actionable knowledge. Now, since I couldn't do a demo given the way we have the AV set up, I'm just going to show you some screenshots from the Climate Web. So here, for example, we've organized a lot of the pieces and moves being used by Team No Urgency. And from any of these links, you can go and dig deeper into the particular move and piece and how it's being used. Or we've integrated all 1,300 of the chess pieces mentioned in this report. And once they're in there, you can slice and dice them in all kinds of ways for all kinds of audiences for purposes of playing climate chess. Or you can come in and look at Project Drawdown, and you can actually go and explore all 80 of the technologies that they're talking about, and because each of them has its own index entry, and you can dig into the literature around those. Or if you wanted to get into the topic of wicked problems and understanding sort of the wicked problem literature, which is all in there, these dashboards that we have, in this case, Wicked Problems 101, pulls together sort of the core information so that in 20 minutes, you can sort of come up to speed on what is this thing, wicked problems, as opposed to spending days, Googling, getting 50 million hits every time you put anything in. We've synthesized, we've organized, and we've linked information together to make it accessible. If you want to get into the individual actions literature, which is enormous, you can do that through the individual actions dashboard. If you want to look at all the different quantitative estimates of what natural climate solutions can accomplish, we've pulled that together in the Climate Web. If you want to look at the best videos that we found in 20,000 hours of looking having to do with behavior change or how to communicate climate change, there's a section in there on communicating with ranchers in terms of what is the literature on how do you talk about climate change with farmers and ranchers. And so and that's not the only audience, it's all sorts of audiences. But all of that we've integrated and organized already so that you don't have to spend hours sort of trying to dig this stuff up, assuming you were so inclined. You can get into much funner topics. You know, climate fiction is this whole genre of new fiction, and you can explore that in the climate web. Is that a way of communicating climate change? The question on that remains open, but there's a massive amount of work going on climate fiction, and there are some really great books that help bring climate change home. One in particular that I read many years ago is called 2084 Tales from the Great Warming, and it's written in 2084 based on interviews done with people who had survived to 2084, but it tells you, you know, when was Florida lost, when was Rotterdam lost, and again, it's fiction, but it's an interesting way of sort of communicating risk and storytelling, which is key for all of this. Or on a less serious note, although for the wine industry it certainly is, you know, wine and climate change. Wine's going to be entirely disrupted by climate change. It's going to be not wine isn't going to disappear, but the existing wine regions are going to stop producing a lot of their wines, and those regions are going to move north. And so it's going to be massively disruptive for the industry, even though 50, 60 years from now, you might think of the industry as being the same industry, but it's totally different than it was today. And that's sort of indicative of what's going on with climate change. So just a few websites if you're interested in looking up. You know, theclimateweb.com is our conventional website regarding the climate web, but theclimateweb.org is actually the climate web itself. It can be a little bit terrifying, but we've tried to organize it so that you can work your way into it. Our organizational website, climatographer.com, and I mentioned this technology that allows us to extract information. Some of the ones that we've done for that, in addition to Climate Chess, are individualaction.climatesites.net, letting you sort of review the entire literature out there on what is it individuals can be doing. I'm not saying I agree with all that literature, but we've pulled it together in that way. And if you want to dig more into how the climate web is built, et cetera, you can do that with the climate web at climatesites.net. So again, I haven't really talked much about carbon offsets, natural climate solutions. I'm happy to do that going forward. I've been working on those topics for decades as well. I'm happy to follow up with questions and conversations that anyone might have. Thank you very much.